for all of you too. I want to echo what others have said. It's been a wonderful time of fellowship. And I also want to echo what others have said about how fantastic a job you all have done in hosting this conference. And thank you for having me. It's a real fun time so far. Well, the good news is in this session, it will not be nearly as gory and gruesome and graphic as what I shared in the last one. So you can breathe a sigh of relief about that. So we are going to finish up our study of parallels between Josephus and the book of Revelation. We're looking at 10 case studies. So far, we've covered 7. We've covered 3 out of the 7 seals, 3 out of the 7 trumpets, and we looked at 1 bull, and we're going to look today at 2 more bull judgments and 1 other item. Good? Or should I hold it? Okay. All right. I have this first century map up here. It actually relates to the last thing I shared in yesterday's session, and it also will relate to the first item I'll be sharing today. So take a quick look at that. This is a map of the Judea province in the 1st century. So we're going to look at case study number 8, which covers Revelation 16, verse 19. And it reads, "Now the great city, as we know and talked about yesterday, is Jerusalem. Now the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." So this is from John's description of the 7th bowl. And we're going to look at a couple of components here. The 3 parts, we'll look at that in a minute. First, we'll talk about the cities of the nations that fell. And I'm going to be talking about 4 different nations where cities fell. And those 4 nations are Galilee, Perea, Idumea, and Judea. Talking about Galilee first, the downfall of the nation of Galilee happened over a several-month period in AD 67. And that whole story can mostly be seen in the Wars of the Jews, Book 3. And now in the previous case study, we saw that Vespasian subdued the entire nation of Perea in the spring of AD 68. And in the summer of AD 68, Vespasian was at Caesarea, and he was ready to march directly to Jerusalem at that time when he learned some big news. Nero had died. And that took place in June of AD 68. So what happened was Vespasian ended up waiting there for almost a year. That's recorded in Wars 4.9.2. We'll get back to him in a minute. But in the meantime, another nation fell at the hands of not a Roman, but a zealot leader. And that was the nation of Idumea. And it was at the hands of Simon Bar Giora, a Jewish zealot leader who the Romans later called the general of the Jews. They saw him as the #1 leader of the revolt. And Josephus tells us that Simon first laid waste the whole country of Idumea, attacking Hebron, ravaging cities and villages, and making Idumea like a desert. Wars 4.9.7. 1 man in his army, not a Roman, but a Jewish zealot. Then Simon compelled a great number of the Idumeans to retire to Jerusalem. He followed them himself also back to the city. Josephus says that Simon was a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves. Imagine that. Simon, greater terror to the people in Jerusalem than the Romans themselves. But the zealots in Jerusalem were even more heavy upon the people than Simon and the Romans. That's a reference from Wars 4.9.10. So it's pretty amazing, but Simon was actually invited into Jerusalem. They didn't know what was coming. The people made joyful acclamation to him as their savior and their preserver, thinking that he would save them from the madness of the zealots. Not what happened. Simon Bar Giora looked upon them all as his enemies, Josephus tells us, Wars 4.9.11. And in April of AD 69, Simon got possession of Jerusalem Soon the stage would be set for Jerusalem to be divided into three factions, something that relates to this Revelation 16:19 text. But first, I want to look at a couple more examples of nations that fell. In May and June of AD 69, Vespasian marched against those places of Judea which were not yet overthrown, sparing only Herodium, Masada, Maturus, and Jerusalem, which was under the control of the Zealots at that time. That's Wars 4.9.9. Then Vespasian paused his campaign again when he learned that Vitellius had become the emperor of Rome. In December then of AD 69, Vespasian himself was named the emperor of Rome. All kinds of transition taking place. Otherwise, Jerusalem may have fallen not in AD 70, but AD 68 or AD 69, if these things weren't happening. And then Vespasian's son Titus was dispatched to put a siege on Jerusalem. That reference is found in Wars 4.11.5 and Wars 5.1.1. And this little table here is a simple table of nations that fell from AD 67 to about the midpoint of AD 69. And this is not exhaustive, but this is certainly a list of nations with quite a number of cities that fell. And I see that as the fulfillment of Revelation 16:19. Maybe others have knowledge of even more places that fell during that time, but a very calamitous time in that part of the world, for sure. And now the other component of Revelation 16:19 is the division of Jerusalem into three parts. And in Wars 5.1.1 and 5.1.4, Josephus described the conditions in Jerusalem at the end of AD 69. He said the sedition at Jerusalem was revived and parted into three factions. And one faction fought against the other. One would not mistake it if he called a sedition or a revolt begotten by another sedition. And to be like a wild beast grown mad, which for want of food from abroad fell now upon eating its own flesh. And he goes on and says, and now there were three treacherous factions in the city, one parted from the other. And he lists the three leaders of those parties: Eleazar ben Simon, John Levi of Geshala, and Simon Bar Giora. So I see this as a very clear fulfillment of John's words that the great city Jerusalem was divided into three parts. And it's also a flashback to what happened in an earlier destruction of Jerusalem, 586 BC. In Ezekiel 5:1-12, we learn that Ezekiel was required to shave his head and divide his head into three parts, or his hairline into three parts. And God told him, this is Jerusalem. 1/3 of his hair was burned, 1/3 of his hair was chopped by the sword, and the last third of his hair was scattered into the wind, as representing what was about to happen to Jerusalem. So it didn't just happen in AD 70, it also happened in 586 BC. Pretty fascinating. All right, the next case study I want to look at, number 9, is also a bowl judgment. This text is Revelation 16:21. Yes.
Can you give the scripture for the Ezekiel reference?
Ezekiel 5:1-12. So Revelation 16:21 reads like this: In great hail from heaven fell upon men, every hailstone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. So this is from the 7th bowl, and I'd like us to compare this text to the following description of large stones that were catapulted over the wall in Jerusalem by the 10th Legion, the 10th Roman Legion, in May of AD 70. This text is from Wars of the Jews 5.6.3. The engines that all the legions had ready prepared for them were admirably contrived, but still more extraordinary ones belonged to the 10th Legion. Now the stones that were cast were of the weight of a talent. Same vocabulary as we read in Revelation 16. and they were carried 2 furlongs and further. The blow that they gave was no way to be sustained, not only by those that stood first in the way, but by those that were beyond them for a great space. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was of a white color, which of course would look like a hailstone, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness. Accordingly, the watchmen that sat upon the towers gave them notice when the engine was let go, and the stone came from the engine. They cried out aloud in their own country language, "The stone cometh." So those that were in its way stood off and threw themselves down upon the ground, by which means and by their thus guarding themselves, the stone fell down and did them no harm. Then the Romans got more clever. The Romans contrived how to prevent that by blacking the stone, who then could aim at them with success, when the stone was not discerned beforehand as it had been till then, and so they destroyed many of them in the temple complex at one blow. So at first these stones were white, giant stones looking like hailstones coming from the sky. Then they painted them black. So John saw hailstones weighing a talent falling from the sky over Jerusalem, and Josephus described the exact same thing. And both of them even cited these stones as weighing a talent, which is about 75 to 100 pounds. So just clear as day comparison right here. And I think this is probably not new to too many people in this room, this particular case. Now, an interesting point is that according to William Whiston's famous translation of the works of Josephus, the watchman actually shouted, "The sun cometh," S-O-N, rather than "the stone cometh." And J. Stuart Russell, in his 1878 book, The Parousia, on page 482, pointed out that it was only 8 years before this event, in AD 62, when James was being martyred, and he cried out that the Son of Man was about to come in the clouds of heaven. So James Stuart Russell speculated that the watchmen were giving this cry, "The sun cometh," as a mockery of the Christian hope of the parousia. This isn't necessarily a fact, but it's his idea. Interesting thought. So I know you won't be able to write down these websites right here, but interestingly enough, these large stones that weighed between 75 and 100 pounds were actually discovered just a few years ago in an archaeological dig. And details and photos can be seen in these 2 articles. I don't know, use your phone maybe and take a picture if you want of the website. Okay. One is from the Times of Israel, and the other one is from the website Haaretz. Very, very interesting. All right, we good? So the next case study I want us to look at will be the last one, number 10. And this is not from one of the seals or trumpets or bowls, but this is from Revelation 17, 12 to 16. By the way, a couple of people have asked me to email them my PowerPoint and or my written notes, and I'm happy to do that for others as well. So feel free to approach me. And that way you'd have that and everything else if you're interested.
Is this case study on your website?
You know what? Actually, it is. This has been modified somewhat, but on my website I have an article with 9 case studies, and then I added one more. I think it was number 2. So it's in 2 separate articles, but yes, it is on my site, adammaarschalk.com, which my site is on your handout. So this case study again is Revelation 17, 12 to 16. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. As I mentioned yesterday, until a couple of years ago, I believed that the beast in Revelation was Rome and Nero, and at that time, I assumed that the 10 horns must have been the 10 senatorial provinces of Rome working with Nero. That was simply an assumption on my part, and I think I've heard others state it without any evidence. Now, and I believe that they must have been the ones who helped persecute Christians and capture and burn Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, when I started to rethink this subject of the beast, one thing I discovered is that when Titus overthrew Jerusalem in AD 70, he was not joined by leaders or representatives of the 10 provinces. In fact, he didn't even have 10 legions with him. Instead, he had 4 legions, the 5th Legion of Rome, the 10th Legion, the 12th Legion, and the 15th Legion. And that reference, those details can be found in Wars 5.1.6. Then I was surprised to discover that Josephus actually listed exactly 10 generals. They were high priests and religious leaders in Israel who were named and given authority as generals in approximately December of AD 66. 3 of those generals were even killed by the Zealots during what was known as the Zealot Siege in early AD 68. And I believe that fulfills Daniel 7 verse 8, Daniel 7:20, and Daniel 7:24, where all 3 verses speak of the downfall of 3 out of 10 horns. And so here's a quick summary of what led up to the selection of those 10 generals. Josephus says that the Jewish-Roman War officially began in August of AD 66, when Eleazar, the son of Ananias, there were several Eleazars, so not to be confused with Eleazar ben Simon, but Eleazar, the son of Ananias, the high priest, who was at that time governor of the temple, he persuaded those who officiated in the divine service to receive no gift or sacrifice for any foreigner. And the Zealots used this new law to reject what was known as the sacrifice of Caesar. That reference is Wars 2.17.2. And the Zealots also went on to massacre the Roman garrison that was stationed at the Antonia fortress on the east side of Jerusalem, Wars 2.17.7. They did a couple more things like that, and soon, before the end of AD 66, the Romans were completely gone from Jerusalem. It was 100% in the hands of the Zealots for the next 3.5 years. Now, in November of AD 66, Cestius Gallus, a Roman general, brought the 12th Legion to put down the Jewish rebellion. At least he attempted to. But surprisingly, his army suffered about 5,700 deaths. His weapons and supplies were stolen during an ambush. They retreated on the 22nd of November, AD 66, and the Jewish rebels chased and killed many of them over the next 5 days, ran them out of town. So the Jewish temple leaders knew that it was inevitable for the Romans to return and bring back all their might and power and crush this thing. It took 3.5 years. They probably didn't think it would be that long, but it was inevitable. So Josephus says that they got together in great numbers in the temple and appointed a great many generals for the war. And that story is in Wars 2.20.3-4. And here is a list of the territories that these 10 generals were to oversee as they prepared for war with Rome. I won't read that verbatim. You can see it there, but you've got them overseeing Jerusalem, Idumea, Jericho, Perea, Lydda, Joppa, the Galilees, Gamala, and Josephus actually was one of these 10 generals. And of course, he was captured at one point. I'd like to look into this more, but As far as those who were killed and Josephus who was captured, were they replaced? It seems like it. Josephus somewhere else made a reference that the zealots appointed leaders as they pleased, according to their own whims. So I imagine that those who fell and were captured in Josephus's case were replaced. Okay. By the way, the three generals who were killed by the zealots were Ananus ben Ananus, Niger of Perea, and Joseph ben Gorion, and their deaths can be found in Wars 4.5.2 and Wars 4.6.1. So real quickly, how did these horns make war with the Lamb? I would say, in a nutshell, Jesus made war against the harlot city, the great city, Jerusalem, and he used the Roman army as his instrument in doing so. And that's stated by Jesus ahead of time in Matthew 22:7. And the zealots and those who were aligned with them fought desperately to maintain power over Jerusalem. They wanted this earthly kingdom, and they wanted to gain independence for Israel. How did they turn on the harlot? Going back to this text here in Revelation 17, how did they turn on the harlot, make her desolate, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire? Well, they were assigned to these various places, and during the Jewish-Roman War, what happened is, I think we're seeing, is that Jerusalem became more and more isolated as the Romans defeated these other territories. And we read about how Simon brought all these Idumeans to Jerusalem. I mean, they were saying, hey, let's go to Jerusalem and lock this place up, defeat the Romans, and we're gonna get this independence. So also, we already saw the quote from Wars 5.1.1 where Josephus described the revolt in Jerusalem in the Civil War, and he described it as a wild beast grown mad, which for want of food from abroad fell now upon eating its own flesh. And we just read in Revelation 17 how they would hate the harlot, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Josephus said they were like a beast eating its own flesh. And Josephus also repeatedly blamed the Jews, especially the zealots, for the very fire that burned Jerusalem and the temple. I could cite quite a number of things, but on that, Josephus quotes this many times. But he says in Wars 6.4.5, these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves and were occasioned by them. So repeatedly, Josephus does not blame the Romans for starting the fire, but the zealots. And in a speech by Titus, he said to the zealots, you have set fire to your holy house with your own hands. I didn't do it, you did it. And Josephus made similar statements in Wars 5.4.4, Wars 6.2.9, and other places. And I would say that all of these statements confirm that Jerusalem was devoured primarily by the zealots, and the Romans only finished what the zealots had already started. So I'm coming now to a conclusion. And we've looked at 10 case studies. And based on these, without being dogmatic, based on these case studies, I would like to tentatively suggest that the seals, trumpets, and bowls were structured like this. The seals being an overview of what was to take place from AD 66 all the way to AD 70. The trumpets taking place from early AD 67 to early AD 68, just a year-long period, based on what I'm seeing so far. And then the Zealot siege took place for a few months at the beginning of AD 68. And then I see the bowls taking place from about the spring of AD 68 to AD 70. If I would use my arm as an analogy, the seals would stretch from my shoulder to my fingers. The trumpets would stretch from my shoulder to about the elbow. The elbow is the Zealot siege at the beginning of AD 68, and then the bowls would be from the elbow to the fingers. Tentative, not dogmatic. This is what I'm seeing so far. And I want to say again that this presentation represents what to me is an ongoing study. I have 10 case studies. There could very well be 20. And there are definitely more parallels to be seen and organized and compiled between the book of Revelation and Josephus that are not included in this particular study. So again, anyone who has, all of you who have heard this and who will hear it on video, you're welcome to evaluate these case studies in this tentative conclusion. If I had more time, I'd open it up to Q&A, but I think I've pretty much used my time. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, but yeah, would love to hear from you.
You know, we've all kind of settled on the 666.
Yeah.
Beast and Nero. How does that work in how you see it?
Okay. Yeah, in my series on the beast, I have not yet written up on that, but I do have notes. And one thing about the equation of Nero and 666, let me see if I can articulate this. My understanding is that it requires a transliteration from Greek to Hebrew, cut out the vowels, and use not his full name, but just his one part of his name, Nero, and his title, Caesar, to get 666 from the Hebrew, which was not the language of the original text. Simon Bar Giora, that name, without any title, apparently using the gematria from the Aramaic equals 666. And a number of scholars believe that Revelation was first written in Aramaic and later translated to Greek. So if that's the case, then that may be what's going on. I need to look into it further. There are a couple of authors who wrote a book about 100 years ago and believed that Aramaic was the original language of Revelation, have pointed out that the Aramaic language of Revelation 13 points to Simon Bar Giora repeatedly. Interesting. I'll be working through that as I add that to my ongoing series on my blog. But yeah, good question, and that's a partial answer.